friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using the Lawn Fawn Bubbles of Joy stamp set. So I've stamped my images out on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. For my little mice, I'm using E50, E51, and E53. I wanted all of these guys to look like part of a little family, so I'm going to be using very similar color combos, but just mixing up slightly on a couple of them. So for this first guy, I started with E53 and laid in some shadows, blended out with the E51, and then I'm finishing with the E50. I'll also add a little E50 to the bottom of his belly and let that fade into the white. For the second little guy, I decided to make him just a little bit lighter, so I'm going to skip the E53 and I just went right in with the E51. I used the E50 as my mid-tone and let that fade into the white on him as well. And then for the third little mouse, I'm going to go back to the full combination. So I'm once again starting with that E53, blending out with the E51, and then finishing with the E50. All of these guys are pretty small, so it's really quick and easy to color them in. For the little baby mouse, I decided to go back to the lighter combo, so I'm starting with that E51 and blending out with the E50 on him. And then for the final mouse, I wanted him to be just a bit darker, so again we have a little bit of variation in their fur color. So I added in the E55 and I'm blending that out with the E53, so that's becoming my mid-tone for this one. And then I'm going to finish him up with the E50. I will go back after I'm done with him and just add a little bit of shading with that E55 to this first little mouse. I'm going to color in one of his ears and then add some color down the back of his head, a little spot on his arm, and some more down the back of his the right side of his body. And then I'm blending that out with the E53 and then again E51. And then I'll skip over to the third mouse and I'm going to do the same thing. That way they all have their own little personality and little spots or details or different shades of fur that just make them each unique. Once I'm happy with these 5 little mice with their fur color, I'm going to add in some pink to their ears and feet. I'm going to use R11 and R20 for that. I'm coloring their noses with the R20 on its own, and then on their ears and feet, I'm adding a touch of that R20 first, and then blending out with the R11. And then I will go back and also give each of these guys some rosy cheeks. So I'll do a small oval shape on the cheek with the R20 and then trace around that with the R11 so it just softens into the rest of their fur color. This has become my favorite combo for rosy cheeks as of late. I've been using it quite a lot because I just love the way it works together. So now I'm going to color in the little bottle of bubbles, and I thought it would be fun to do it in purple. I have always loved purple, and as a child I always reached for the purple bottle if one was available, so I thought it would be fun to do that. And I'm using VO5, VO6, and VO9. I used the VO9 to cast a little shadow onto the different sections of the bottle and then blended out with the VO6 and then added the highlight with the VO5. For the cap, I'm just adding a little W1 and then I'll use Y15 for the bubble wand. And then I'm going to move on to the coloring of the bubbles, and I'm doing this very similar to the way that I did it in a previous video, but this time I'm using VO1, RO1, and B00. starting with that V01 and doing about a third of a circle, and then coming in with the B00 next, finishing with the R01, and then adding a little colorless blender to the center just to kind of push that color back toward the edges so it gets a little bit more hazy in the center. So now I'm going to go through and do all of the bubbles at once. I did the V01 just like I mentioned. I did it all in the same exact spot so everything would look nice and consistent. And then I'm coming in and doing another little third of that circle with the B00, making sure to overlap a little of that V01, and then doing the same with the R01, overlapping a little of the B00 and the V01, just to kind of connect them all. And then going back with my colorless blender and just doing a little circle in the center. And then I'll trim these images out with their matching dies. I wanted to create a cloudy sky for my background so that my little mice can be sitting outside blowing their bubbles. So I'm using a piece of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock and the Lawn Fawn Cloudy Stencil with some Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink. So as I'm moving off that stencil with that ink blending tool, I'm pushing down pretty firmly and then immediately kind of lifting up so that I get a dark concentration of color right above the cloud formation, and then it gets immediately softer so that it just looks really lovely and cloudy, you know, and it's just very dreamy looking. So I will turn my stencil in different orientations so I get a different cloud formation each time. And I went down 4 times on this panel. I am going to cut it down quite a bit, but I wasn't sure how much I would have that would be showing, so I just went ahead and filled the whole scene. It's a lot easier to do that than to have to come back and add it later if it wasn't quite long enough. So I just added a bit of color down at the bottom with what was left on that mini ink blending tool, and then I pressed some of that color onto my Waffle Flower mini media mat. I'm going to squirt that with some water and mix that up with a paintbrush so it gets kind of in a watery consistency, and then tap that on my finger so I get a nice splatter effect in the background just to create some extra texture and movement in the scene. I'll set that off to the side to dry, and now I am going to use another piece of Bristol, which I die cut with the mushroom border. There's a grassy border that's included in that die set, and that's what I used because I wanted this kind of rounded hill. And I'm blending on some Mowed Lawn Distress Oxide ink, trying to be careful with the little grassy points because they can get bended easily, so just trying not to press down too hard, but I do want a higher concentration of color at the top edge. So I will go in with some Lucky Clover as well to darken that up. So I'm just going to blend that on, and then I'll go back to my Mowed Lawn ink blending tool and just kind of smooth over the transition of those 2 shades. I'll press some of that Lucky Clover ink onto my work surface as well, water that down, pick it up with my paintbrush, and do some more splatter details so everything matches really nicely. And then I'm going to set these 2 panels aside to dry until they have completely. Then I'm going to take the Lawn Fawn circle stackables and lay those down where I want them on my scene, tape them into place with a little bit of Post-it tape, and run that through my die cutting machine so it cuts out 3 little windows. So I will just, I'm going to end up tossing those little pieces because I won't need them again. You could save them for another card, but I don't have anything planned for them. What I do want to do though is create another background to go behind them. So I'm going to set a piece of white cardstock behind and trace those openings so that I can create some more bubbles that will fit exactly in those little windows. So I'm going to go back to my Copic Coloring. I'm going to go to the same markers that I used the first time. So I'm using that V01 and laying in that little third of a circle, or a little bit more than a third, because I want to overlap the colors and have them run together a little bit. So I'm laying that down in kind of like a broad arc. And then I'm going to come in with my next shade, which is the B00. And you can see a little bit better on these larger bubbles how I overlap into the previous color just a little bit to kind of create a nice transition from shade to shade. Once I have the B00 laid in, I'm going to go to the R01 and complete the circle there and just overlap into the purple and the blue. But because I have so much more room in these larger bubbles, I actually want to blend these out a bit more than just with my colorless blender. So I'm going to go to the next shade down that I have for each of these marker colors. I'm using V000 to blend out the inner part of the purple. And then I'll use B000 for the inner part of the B00. Just laying that down pretty heavily so that everything is nice and smooth and blended. And for the pink, I'm going to use R000 to blend out the R01. So I could have done these on the smaller ones as well, but if I had, it would have filled in the center of the bubbles completely because they're so much smaller. And I really wanted that white space in the center because that's what makes it look, you know, really shiny, like it's catching the light. So I'm going to grab my colorless blender and do the same thing, just run that around the inside edge of that. And then I'm going to erase my pencil marks so none of that will show. I've added a whole bunch of Scotch 3M foam tape to the back of my cloudy background. I really want this to be well supported, so when I send it through the mail, it's not going to cave in anywhere. So I'm just peeling off those release papers and putting them in my Twiddler's Nook embellishment tray just to keep them all contained, and then I can take that to the trash nice and easy. So I'm going to line that up over the bubbles that I've colored and then press that down into place. Next, I'm going to stamp my sentiment, and I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink because I use those Distress Oxides. I find that this lays really well over the Distress Oxides and stays nice and crisp. So I'm doing the sentiment that says, "I'm blown away by your kindness." Then I'll set that aside to dry, and I'll pop my card base in my MISTI. I'm using a piece of Lawn Fawn Mermaid cardstock and stamping in Peacock ink. And I'm going to do another little mouse and some bubbles and the sentiment that says, "May your day be filled with bursts of joy." Then I will take my background piece and I'm going to adhere that to my card front just by adding some liquid glue to the back of that and then lining that up so that it's nice and straight on the card. I gave that a couple seconds to dry so it wouldn't slide around on that base, and then added my grassy border to the bottom as well, just making sure that the bottom corners are all lined up. So now I'm ready to bring in my images and set my little scene. So I'm going to start with this little guy here because I wanted him to be the one who was blowing all the bubbles for the rest of the little family to enjoy. So I'm going to grab that bubble wand and adhere that into his outstretched arm so it looks like he's blowing the bubbles that are going around the entire scene here. And I did tuck the bottom edge of that bubble wand behind his tail just to integrate that a little bit more into the scene. And then I'm gonna wait on the bubble container. I wanted to put it in his hand, but I wasn't quite sure, so I decided to wait and see if I needed something to fill in any spaces at the bottom for now. So This next little guy, I wanted it to seem as if he is blowing the smallest of those bubble windows up into the air for the little baby mouse to catch. So I have them kind of positioned right below that one. And then the one that is kind of laying down, I'm going to have that above the medium-sized window cutout bubble. And then this third little guy, I decided to put him in the center of the largest one. And I wasn't sure if I should tuck his feet under the bottom edge of the window, but it didn't look like he was floating in the center that way, so I did move him up more towards the middle of that bubble. Then I have this large bubble cluster, so I'm going to add that to fill in that top left corner and just have those little pops of color up there as well. And then with the rest of these balloons, I'm just going to add them here and there wherever I think that they look good and try to balance out the little sizes. So I didn't want like all of the teeny tiny ones right on top of each other. I want them to be more spread throughout the scene. So I'm just adding them here and there wherever I think they look good. And with the super teeny tiny ones, I found it was easier just to add the glue straight to the card and then put the bubble down on top of it. So I did decide to go ahead and add the container of bubbles into the first little mouse's hand. So I did that on the far left, and then the teeny tiny bubbles, I wanted those to be escaping from the lid, so I just added those over there. And to go along with those sparkly bubbles, I decided to add my favorite embellishment, some Stardust stickles. So I'm just adding kind of a small amount to each of the bubbles and then using the nozzle to spread that out in a large semicircle on the right hand side of each of the bubbles. So I started with the 3 bubble windows, but I also added it to all of the little bubbles as well, so they all look consistent and have that little bit of glimmer on them. So I'm going to pick that up to the light so you can see how that sparkles and shines and gives you a look at all of the detail and another peek at the inside as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I post new ones every Monday and Friday. If you're interested in any of the products I used today, you'll find them listed and linked in the description bar below. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. You can click on either one of those to check them out. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have an absolutely amazing day. Bye-bye.